present. So yeah, tonight we're going to talk about Lightning Connect Apex Connector Framework. A little bit about myself first. I'm a solutions architect here at Trifecta. I'm the one of the leaders of the Northeast Pennsylvania Salesforce user group. And on the PowerPoint there, you can see my Twitter handle and my LinkedIn account. So let's get started. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to give you a brief introduction to Lightning Connect. We're going to talk about the connector framework specifics, and then we're going to show you some code at the end to see how it all works and put all the pieces together. So first, a little bit about Lightning Connect. Lightning Connect was developed as a way of being able to integrate Salesforce with an external data store without having to bring the data into Salesforce. A lot of integrations in the past have been your typical, you have a piece of middleware that syncs data between the external system and the internal and Salesforce itself. So Salesforce worked to develop what's called Lightning Connect. And the first version that was brought out was based on the OData 2.0 standard that was developed by Microsoft. The initial connection that they put together only supports read. So as of spring 15 and summer 15, they support read capabilities from an external data store, providing that it's an OData 2.0 connection. In summer 15, they expanded that. They brought out a Lightning Connect for Salesforce, so you could connect Salesforce to Salesforce using this connection. And then they also brought out the very first version of the Apex Connector framework. So the next version, which is coming in winter 16, very shortly, will be the OData 4.0 version, which will not only support read capabilities, it will also support create, update, and delete of external records. So let's dig into basically the framework for Lightning Connect using Apex. So with with summer 15, they introduced the framework and this data source namespace. As part of that, you have to create a couple of classes in order to make that connection happen. The first one is a data source.connection. And when we go into the code, I'll show you the specifics of it. But basically, there's a couple of methods that you would need to override to actually enable that. And then there's the data source provider. So the provider is basically what groups everything together, creates your actual external connection to look at that external data source and be able to read the data and basically marshal that into these external objects that we're going to create. The next piece of it is actually creating the external data source. So just like with an OData 2.0 connector, with that one you would go into Salesforce, you'd go to the external data source under setup, and you would select the OData 2.0 and you'd put a URL in. Well, by generating a connection in a provider class, now this custom connection from the Apex framework will show up as a custom provider, which you can then register and then create external objects against that. Obviously, external objects, they're the key here. External objects look very similar to regular Salesforce objects. They have page layouts, they have fields, but there are limitations. There's no formula fields currently available, and there are some limitations on some of the other data types that are available. So let's dig into the mechanics of these classes. So the first is the data source connection. There's two ways to get through this. The first part is the programmatic piece, and actually I should have that listed first. So the first thing that you need to override is this sync method, and what that does is the sync method needs to return a data source.table. What the sync method does is it allows you to define what your tables are going to be or what your external objects are going to be programmatically, so that you can generate them from code. So if you have a standard set up, you can actually do that. You can hard code in what your tables look like, the fields, the names, all those things. And then that sync method will read those and generate your external objects for you. So what is a data source table? It's basically an object. It's got a bunch of properties and it's basically a list of columns on it. So the properties that are there are the list of columns, a description, label plural, label singular, a name, and a name column. So some of those properties look very much like the regular Salesforce objects. You know, when you create a regular Salesforce object, you've got a name, a plural label, a single label, and a few other things. And then you have the data source column. So the column itself has its own properties. Going through those, they're kind of self-explanatory. Decimal places, description, filterable, label, length, etc. They all have specific uses depending on the type of column that you're creating. And I'll show you some examples of that later when we actually go into the connection that I've created and show you that table data layout. So once you've got your connection created, then you can go ahead and create your provider class. Part of that is 3 methods that you will override. The first is get connection. And what that would do is that would bring back basically a connection, a data source connection object. And that is used to actually connect to your external data source. That, along with the authentication capabilities, which are listed at the bottom, help you determine how you're going to create that connection and the information you're going to pass over for authentication. And then the middle one, the capabilities. The capabilities are what this connection or what this provider is going to support. So there's a get capabilities method you override. With that, there's some enumerated values. So those start with row query. Obviously, that's what allows you to query the external data source and read the data. Then there's a search capability. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about this framework is you can actually do SOCL search. You can do SOCL queries, and you can do SOCL searches against the external data source, providing you have the search turned on. So if you have search turned on, it'll support SOCL queries. The require endpoint, what that is there for is when you're bringing data back and you're constructing it back into the external object, if you have require endpoint enabled, that means you have to supply an actual HTTP endpoint that it can use to go get that next piece of data or that row of data. Require HTTPS is I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It means you got to use an HTTPS encrypted connection. Query total size and query pagination server driven. These are for basically pagination of your data. So you can enable this by saying, I want my query total size to be 50 records. And it will go, and providing that your endpoint supports it, you could pass that parameter over to your endpoint and request 50 records, bring that back along with some information about where you are essentially in that query locator on the external system. The other option you have is the pagination server driven. That basically, by enabling that, that means you don't have control over pagination. The server that you're calling is going to handle all that and give it back to you. So you just you keep making requests and it'll keep coming and giving you chunks of data back. And lastly, the authentication capabilities. Currently, they support these 4 methods. Anonymous, no security, it's wide open. You just hit the endpoint, you're going to get whatever you ask for. There's basic authentication, so you could set up a username and password that it could pass in and use. Digital certificate, and lastly, OAuth. Keep in mind, the connection parameters and the authentication. There may be some work that you have to do in order for the OAuth to work properly and to keep that token up to date and refreshed. So let's talk about the actual connection, what happens. So most of the conversation this evening is going to be around the query method. So when you ask for data, so just like in a list view or a tab or a detailed record, in the underlying hood, under the hood of Salesforce, you're actually executing some sort of query. There's no different for an external object for this Apex framework. So the first thing in your connection class that you would do is, along with your sync method, you would override this query method. And what it does is it passes in this query context. So the query context is broken down into a couple of sections. The first one is the table selection. So it's kind of cool if you have an endpoint that you would be calling, or maybe you're just doing queries against another database somewhere. It will actually pass in the list of columns that you've asked for. So in a list view, if you have, you know, ID, name, start date, end date, creation date as the columns in that list view, when you look at the query context and you look at the columns selected, those columns will be in this list here. You won't see any of the other columns. So it's being very efficient in what it's asking for. The next part is the filter. So that's a class called dataSource.filter. That gives you all your information about the where clause that you would be asking for. Keep in mind when you're doing a filter, the filter could have sub-filters. So it could be, you know, so think of like where x equals y plus and, you know, a equals b and b equals c, things like that. So the filters can become very complex, but you can write some helper classes to help you, you know, figure out what it is that's being asked for, so you know how to talk to the system that you're going to query. The dataSource.order, just like a SOQL query or a SQL statement, it's the order by. So it's basically the string of how you want these things ordered, what column for sorting you want first, second, third. And then the table selected is a string. So that's the name of the table, that's the reference of what you're asking for. And I'll show you that in the code, how that works. So as I stated earlier, you can also do SOSL queries provided you have the search enabled. The search is a different context that comes in. So there's a method for search that you would override, passes in the search context, and then you basically have to disassemble that context. Look for the search phrase, which is simply a string, and then the table that you was asking for that information, the table that's in reference. I haven't really played around with the search yet. I was at a session at Dreamforce where one of the technical developers on this product presented, and he showed the search, and it actually worked, which was pretty cool.
That recording's probably out.
And that recording should be online from Dreamforce. Wow, time for code. Cool. So let's get started. I'm going to switch over to Sublime here. So I've already gone out and I've created the code that we're going to use today, but what I'll do is I'll walk through it so you can actually see it in action. So this is my sample connection. I just call it sample connection class. You'll see that when you create it, you have to extend the dataSource.connection. Otherwise, that's the hook to get these overridden methods actually working to get to those contexts. So here you've got the sync method. So within my sync method, I'm creating a list of tables, of dataSource.tables, and I've written basically two methods below that are private that constructs those tables, and I'm adding them to that list so I can return them from the sync method. So I'm going to jump down lower in the code and show you that real quick. So here's my get bill table and my get bill table item, bill item table. So you'll see I create a new instance of the table. I populate the name, the plural name, the singular name, the name column. I create a list of columns, and then I I basically go out and I create each one of these columns. I wrote a little helper method called create column where I just pass everything in and it gives me the created column back. So these are all the parameters that I would send in order to create it. And the data types are here. So again, in part of that data source namespace, they've got everything documented, the data types, the enumerated values that you would use. So you'll see here, like string short type, that's equivalent to a text field that you would create on a standard object that's 255 characters long. A couple of the others that you'll see here are URL type. So URL is just like a regular URL field. Date, time, number type. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, I don't think I have any long text in here. No, I don't have any long text, but there is a long text field. So basically what you can see here is I'm creating an external ID field and a display URL field. Those are two fields that are required on every external object. So if you're creating them programmatically, you have to include those two fields. If you create them via point and click, which you can do, it'll create those for you. So you don't have to worry about it that way. But if you're programmatically creating them, you need to actually code those up and make sure you're creating them as external short type and URL type. So I'm going through, I'm creating all these. I've got names for them. I've got labels, the lengths for them. So you'll see here for like lengths, I'll jump down to my helper method. So the first thing I'm passing is the decimal places. So that's really key for when you're creating number fields. So just like when you create a number field in a regular Salesforce object, you have the size that you can say, I want it to be 2 decimal places or 3 decimal places. You can do the same thing here. So I do that, my description, whether the field is filterable or not. So can you use this to filter data? The label for it, the length of it. So up here in the first one that I create, my item ID, you'll see I pass in 18 as the length. So I want that field to be 18 characters long. The name of it, reference target field and reference to, those are used to create links to, okay, those are used to create links to Salesforce objects or other external objects inside Salesforce. And I'll show you how those work. I tried programmatically creating those and ran into some issues with them. So I'll show you how you can create those using point and click. Sortable, whether the field is sortable, and then lastly, the data type. So I go through, I pass those in, I create the column, and I return the column back, which I then add to my list of columns. So let's see. The next piece is the query. So here is the, sorry. So if you want to see those again, there they are. I'll scroll back up here. The next part that you would, or method you would override, is the query method. And again, here's the context. You can see here, I can debug the query context out. So I'll show you what that query context looks like when we actually make a request, so you can see the details of it. So here, what I'm doing here is I'm first creating a list of a map of string and object. So why do we do that? That's the data structure that Salesforce uses for external objects. Is a field is basically the entry of the map, string and object. String being the field name, the object being the value. And all you're doing is you're creating a list of them. So you can go through and create that. When you put that map in the list, that map, the instance of that one map represents a row of data. So I'm first creating that map. Next thing I'm doing is I'm looking at the context and I'm finding out what is the table that I'm being asked for. So that's context.tableselection.tableSelected. And I'm checking that now. So what I'm actually going to be doing here is I'm going to be making a call out to a REST endpoint and doing a get and pulling that data back in and displaying it. So I want to look at it and see what my context is. so that I can pass it off to this service, and I'll show you the details of the service of what we're actually doing internally. There's some neater ways of doing this. I just wanted to show you that you could inspect the table name and make decisions on that. You'll see if I look at if the table coming in question is the bill item, I'll pass it off to the bill item service. I call that service. There's a method on that called execute query, and I get the context back, or pass in the context, and I return basically the map of, or the list of map of string and object. Okay, so finally, search. So this is where you would implement your search functionality to go out and search through that external system. The endpoint that I'm using doesn't support searching, so I could have just turned it off and not overridden this, but I wanted to show at least structurally what it looked like. And then coming up in Winter 15, there'll be two new methods that you can override. Upsert rows. So upsert rows is used for creating and updating rows in the external system, and that has a new context called the upsert context. That's a very simple context. It's got a table selected, and then it basically has a list of a map of string and object. So that's how it's passing the data back to you. And then the delete rows, which I have commented out here, has a delete context. And they also have their respective result to go back. So upsert result and delete result. A little bit later, if we have time, I'll go through some details about that. So I've created my connection. Now I need to go and create my provider. So in my provider, here I've got my get connection, and I can basically create my connection parameters. So that's my sample connection class. So I'm creating a new instance of that and passing it back into the framework. Here's my authentication capabilities. I'm enabling those to say, oh, I'm only going to support anonymous because I'm going to take care of that in my call out. I'm actually going to take care of the security in my call out for right now. And here are my capabilities for what I'm going to support. So here you'll see I'm going to support row query. If I uncomment row create, row update, and row delete, I'll get a nice little extra checkbox in the UI when I create the external data source to ask me, do you want to allow these things to happen?
Does that go down by object type that you're doing it, or for the whole?
For the whole framework.
So if you want to be able to delete certain rows but not others, you have to invent some magic.
Actually, you can use security to do that.
Okay.
So the neat thing about the external objects is with Winter 16, you'll not only be able to say, oh, this person has read access, but they also have edit access or delete access.
Okay. So full CRUD.
So it's full CRUD. Yep, so you'll be able to control it that way through profiles.
Okay.
But this is just enabling the connection, what the connection in general is going to support.
Do I have to implement that method though on the other classes?
Yep.
Other objects, so
Yep.
I don't, even though I can't delete it, if you turn delete on, I got to implement that interface.
It depends on how you do it. What I did is, I'll show you, is I wrote this REST service interface. So I basically say anybody who implements this interface has to implement these methods.
Okay.
And you'll see what I did in one of them is I just return an empty data set, or I throw an error that says it's not supported. So here's my provider. I compile that. At that point, I can go and I can create my connection. So let me go and do that. So I'm going to hop over here into Salesforce, maybe. Here we go. So I'm on the external data sources page, and I'm just going to refresh this, make sure I didn't time out. And here's where I actually create the instance of that connection and that provider. So I say new external data source. I give it a name. Keep in mind, names, just like for the actual name and the source, you don't want to put any spaces in here, and I believe it yells at you. So here under my type, because I've compiled my provider as sample provider, it now shows up as Lightning Connect : custom - sample provider. I am in a Winter 16 org here, so you'll see that the OData 4.0 is available, so I could use that also. But for today, we're going to use the sample provider. And because I don't have the capabilities of create, edit, and delete enabled, I don't have this extra. I don't have an extra checkbox here that would show that would turn on the allow that function. And you'll see here I can only select anonymous because that's all I've enabled in my provider. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save.
What was the high data volume?
So the high data volume is there. It's there for bringing over large pieces and large chunks of data. But when you enable that, you're limiting some of your other capabilities like chatter, things like that. The help menus will tell you that.
Do you know what they consider the threshold for how you looked at it? If not,
I haven't looked at that yet. Haven't looked at it. So at this point, I've got a connector. But as you can see, I'm going to drop down here to external objects. I don't have any external objects yet. So what I have to do is I can either go and hand create them one by one, or I can hit this validate and sync. So what the validate and sync will do is it'll actually go out and try and connect to that endpoint that I've decided to use and validate it. And because I programmatically create my, I'm programmatically creating these. Remember my sync method returned 2 tables. These are the 2 tables. So now I can select them and say sync, and it'll create them for me. And now they came back and they say, look at that. You have 2 tables, 2 external objects called bill and bill item. I can go and edit them, I can erase them, or I can look at them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and look at them. And there's all my fields that I've defined. You can see now it looks just like a regular S object in Salesforce. I've got my standard fields, display, and external ID, and all my custom fields that I created. I've got a page layout. I could even do field sets. I can do compact layouts. I can do search layouts. I can override buttons. So it looks just like an S object at this point. And my bill item, same thing, looks the same way. A couple of things you'll see here that are a little unique to this though, is that you have these fields called, you have this field called external data source. So that tells me that this object is tied to that external data source. You could create multiple external data sources if you have the licenses for it. So you can buy Lightning Connect licenses to create multiples. And so you could create, you know, as many as you want, connect to them all. But this is a way of knowing, oh, this object is tied to that one. And you'll see here the table name is displayed here. So that's important because remember we talked about the table selection, the selected table that comes back in the context. That's where it gets this name from, right here, this table name. So I could actually create this and give it a different table name that would be my external data. So if my external system, the table name was not called bill, it was called invoice, I could call this invoice. And now through my code, I could say, oh, I'm in the context of invoice. I can construct an endpoint dynamically and go out and get it. Okay, so let's talk about how these work now. So I'm going to hop back over into code quickly.
One thing worth calling out
is
the API name. Did you get X instead of C?
Oh, yeah, very good point. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, you'll see here the API name is _X, meaning external object, not _C for custom. But you will see, though, all your fields are still _C fields, so they're still custom fields. All right, so what happens? Let's hop over into my my sample connection. So again, when I do a query, it comes in here, I inspect the table name, and then I pass you off to the bill service. So what happens in the bill service? So in the bill service, I'm going to take a look at what's actually being asked for. So mine is very simple. I'm just basically, I have a primary key, in this case called bill ID. And I want to know the context of what I'm searching. I already know the context is bill because I'm in the bill service, but I want to go and I want to look at what's my filter. So I do my I go get my filter using context.tableselection.filter. The first thing I check is if the filter is null. If the filter is null, you just landed on a tab. Okay, so if you create a tab for this object, you go to that tab, you don't have any filter context. So it's just going to be there. You get a null filter. So the assumption is I landed on a tab, therefore I can decide if I'm going to do something or not. In this case, I'm just going to go get in bill, and if the rows are there that were my recently looked at bills, they should show up in that recent items on the tab. The next thing I'm going to check for is the external ID. So the external ID, when you look at a detail page, the framework passes in the external ID into as the filter name, the column name. So now you know, oh, I'm looking at an instance of one record for this. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to basically, I have this helper item that's going to send my request out to my endpoint. I'm constructing, I'm doing a get, and I'm constructing the endpoint dynamically by saying, oh, here's my bill / my ID number, my bill ID, the column value I'm passing in, and I expect to get some rows back. And then I'm going to take those rows and I'm going to decipher them and put them in the right order, not the right order, but the right data, get them into that list of the map and string with the object. And there's a couple of cool things you can do that I'll show you the differences between my bill and my bill item to show you how you can map them or not map them and have them dynamically work. So all I'm doing is I'm making the call, doing the call out, providing my call out doesn't throw any errors. I get the body, and I execute this get item class, which is down below in the code. And then I basically create this table result. This is a factory method supplied by Salesforce. It'll generate the table result for you. You just pass in the original context that was passed into your class and your rows of data that you're sending back. And it'll return them back. This returns them back through the framework to display. And the last one here, account. I'm going to show you that after I create a link where I link this bill to an account. So I can create bill as a related list on the account. All right, so all this one is doing is it's saying, oh, if my context is account, I'm doing a get, and I'm dynamically generating this endpoint. That's the account / the ID of the account, because it's going to pass me the ID of the account. We'll see that in the query context. / bills to return all the bills for that account. And then I pass it into the get list to, again, map that data over properly. So one of the things I want to show you real quick here is what I've done is on my REST endpoint, my fields are named in a certain way. But when I generated my table, I didn't necessarily follow that naming convention. You'll see I use some capitals instead of all lowercase or camel casing. In order for them to map, the string of the field has to match the string of the response coming back. If they don't, you have to manually map them. So all I did here is I just showed that you could manually map them. I took the external ID field that I had to add, and I'm telling it that, oh, the bill ID coming back from my response is going to be my external ID, and I'm going to populate the external ID field with that number. And then I return that new row back into the objects so that they can be displayed. I'm doing a little bit of date time conversion because my date times coming back are a string value. So I need to convert them and reparse them out so they actually created a date time. Okay, so let's see how this works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a link to an internal object. So I'm going to say new, and in this case now you can see I have some new lookup relationships, external and indirect. So I'll choose indirect, because I want it to go to an Salesforce object. Now, what I've done is I'm going to link this to account. I've created an external ID field on the account called account ID. That field has to be an external ID and it has to be a unique value. Those two properties have to be set on that field or you can't link to it. So you'll see here, related to account. I'm going to select next, and it's going to ask me what's my target field. So this is the account ID _C that I created on the account object, which is my key for this system. And that's the value when I do as a related list that's going to be passed in through the query context as the value. So here, my length, I'm just going to put in 255, field name, account, external column name, account. I can just use account here. Also, I could use account ID, but because I'm manually mapping it around, it'll work for me. So next, relationship name, bills. Yep, great. I hit next. Here you can see my visibility. So I can see, yeah, is it visible to these profiles? Or I can also mark it read only. So this is new in 16. In summer 15, read only is automatically checked because you can only ever read data. And do I want to add that to my page layout? Sure, why not? And I'm going to add it to all of them. And I just created my account lookup to link bill to account. So let's go out here to accounts. And before I do that, actually, I'm going to turn on my debug logs real quick. So let's go to my debug logs. You can see I was looking at this earlier. Get rid of all these. I'm actually going to delete this and create a new one. So new. This is an interesting part. For those of you who haven't seen Winter 16 yet, you can now schedule debug logs. How cool is that? So I could say, oh no, I only want to debug between 7:19 and 8 o'clock. And you have a new debug level that you can define. So I've already got a debug level in here called debug. You create that the first time. And you can set the parameters of what you're getting. And so you can have multiple debug types. So I'm going to save that. So let's go out here to account. And if I did everything right, oh, I don't think I did. I should have bills here, and I don't. So let's see what happened. Let's look at my debug log. Yeah, it would have helped if I used the right window. Debug logs. So here's a couple of things you'll see. So when you look at the debug logs, any request that's made from an object to display related lists, you'll see this operation called UI/common list related list servlet. That's what's actually being instantiated and making through the Apex framework and used to load that related information. So here's my query context. And I'm going to copy this out real quick. You can see there's a whole bunch of information in here. And I'm going to pop over here, and I think I can do this in my apps, my JSON editor. Oh, shoot, I thought I could do that here. Anyway, I can at least display it. So the one thing that you can see, there's a bunch of columns that are being called. Those are my columns that were in my query. But what I'm really concerned about is getting down here to this area. So here's my, it starts off, even though it's a query context, it's inherited from the read context. The read context is the abstract class. So in this case, it looks as though this is asking for external ID and bill. In my column selected, my table is bill, is what I'm being asked for, and that. So I thought that should have been my, geez, I had this working and I wanted to delete it all and make it work here. Okay. So I have to figure out why that didn't work. However, what I will do is I will create a tab quickly and show you the tabs and that the tab should work. So create tab, new custom tab, bill. I'm going to use airplane and hit next. Yeah, good for all the profiles. I just want to show it on the platform for now. And hit save. And now I've got my bills tab. So here's my bills. When I go out and connect, look, I have data. Data came back. Let me edit this view and show you some more data. So here's my external ID. I'm going to show you the bill number and status, the creation date, the currency. So these are all fields that are out there. And save. Voila, data that came back in a list view from my bill. I can drill into that, and that should show me the detail of my bill. So I could go and edit the page layout here, just like the regular object. Can drag and drop fields, add sections, do all that great stuff. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is show you how to relate the bill item to a bill. So I'm going to go back into setup, and I'm going to go to develop external objects and my bill item. I'm going to create an external lookup. So I do an external lookup. I say next, and here I'm going to select bill because I want to relate my bill item to the bill. So my length 255. My field name is going to be bill ID. My external column name I'm going to label bill ID. Bill ID. Related list, all the normal visual stuff, where I want it to be. Do I want to add it? Yep, I want to add it. Save. Great. So now when I come back to my bill, I look at my bills, hit go, and I click on the first one, I should have bill items. And you'll see, look, I have one record down here. Quickly edit the page layout and drag a couple of different fields into that so it looks like I have some real data. There's my credit, my description, and my due date for this item. Save. And there's my data. So I just made, when I called this bill, that actually made an external call to the endpoint and brought that data back, and it also made another call to the endpoint to bring back my list of items. And if I looked at my query context, I would see in that the query for the external ID for this, and then I would see a reference to bill, and I'd pass in the bill ID number. One thing I did want to show you, when I created the bill item record or object, one of the things you'll notice here is I followed the case for my external alias of the fields. I followed the correct case sensitivity for all those fields to match the endpoint. And by doing that, when I look at my bill item service, which was called, and I map my fields, you'll notice down here in my map row, I don't have to map one-to-one, remap them all, because I matched the casing and the names of my external columns. It automatically managed that for me. The only thing I'm doing here is I'm doing the data conversions from the string into the date time format so that it knows how to handle that. So all I'm doing is taking that incoming row, iterating through these and saying, oh, here, take these, change them over, and put them back in that map. So it'll overwrite the map of what's already there. Cool way to do this would be to actually, and I did this in another org, I don't have it in this one, is you can actually do a describe on the external object and look at all the fields and iterate through those, create a list of field names that are date times, pass them into a method with the row, iterate through and change them all in one swipe, and then pass them back. So, kind of short on time at this point. Questions? Anybody? Bueller?
Those two new lookup fields, external and internal, on those new with winner 16.
So those are available. Those became available with the framework, with the Apex framework. So those are actually available in summer 15. In summer 15, you can do read. You can do read only. So you can still create those indirect and external lookups. One of the things you can do, I didn't cover this, is you'll notice here there is a regular lookup relationship. If you take the ID of the internal object, so let's say the account ID, and I would store that in my external system, I could do the lookup this way, doing lookup relationship, because then it knows, oh, this field coming in is a lookup to account. Couple of things to keep in mind. You still have to write unit tests for all these classes. That doesn't go away. And currently, you have a 100 object limit. So you can't create more than 100 external objects. I don't have confirmation on this, but I believe it's linked to the fact that you can only do 100 callouts in the context of a process. So yeah, that's why. Because when I rendered this page, I actually did 2 callouts. I did one to get the bill and another one to get the related items. So if I had, a list of multiple related items that were all external, I'm doing multiple external callouts. So your external system has to be able to handle that load also.
On updates, I assume there's no transactional control if I have multiple sources on the same page. That I really need to write one service to fetch both, to accept both, and then do something with it on my end.
Yeah, you'd have to manage the transaction control manually to say, oh, well, this was the record before.
Right.
I'm going to go update it, and I'm going to go update the next one and the next one. And if the third or fourth one fails, I have to roll them all back and reinsert the original records. You'd have to write that.
But there's no concept of I've got record source A on the top of the screen and something else on the bottom, and when I go to insert, A dies, and therefore, or A works, B dies, and then I can call some rollback. It won't happen.
You have to control that.
Write a service that'll take both to the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm just having trouble understanding a practical situation where someone would use this instead of just putting the data in Salesforce.
Oh, so this example. This is
Go ahead.
So this example is connecting to a rating and billing telco billing system.
Okay.
And so, given the fact that this system rates about 10,000 call records a second,
yeah, big time.
Salesforce would choke. So there's no reason, there's no way to get that data in, and you don't want it in there. It's so that bill item are items that are coming out of a billing run, and so as this project that we did is really taking Salesforce and being able to dip into a rating and billing system and pull up your last telephone bill and look at all of your details on your records, because you would not want to put all of those detail records inside of it, because you would just pay out the nose for storage instead of it. So yeah, it's high volumes of data. So thought I recognized that example you did there.
Yes, you did. I think that's because I labeled this wrong. Let me go back to account, see if this will actually work now. I fixed it. So here I just did the account, and if I scroll down to the bottom, there are my 2 bill records that are for the account. If I go out here, I have a REST client that I'm using. So if I look at my, let's see. Where is it? Yeah, sorry, I'll just hack it real quick. /account/1/build. and that these are my 2 builds that I brought back. So there's the raw JSON that came out of the endpoint. You can see here the dates that I converted, the strings that I converted into dates. So you can have control over what you need to convert. And again, I could come back to the page layout, edit it, move it up and down on the page, all those cool things. So here I can drill into the bill, and I can look at the detail of the bill and the bill items. One of the things that still has yet to be resolved that you'll see here, even though I have that account field, I don't have any information about that account right here on this page. You'll see that that's blank. It's still a slight issue. There's still a little idiosyncrasies here and there with this framework. And because this is a pre-release org, that might get straightened out. But, it's coming along. It's come a long way since the beginning, since they brought the read-only out. So, any other questions? Carl, I thought you had one. No? Okay.
Nice.
Cool. Well, thank you, guys. So real quick, I do on nealhobert.com, I do have a blog about this. I've actually written 2 blogs, one about the read, one about the update. My next one will be about tests, about how to test them. And then lastly, there's some new things that are coming in Winter 16 for Visual Force pages, how you use it in Visual Force pages. There's some new methods on the database method or on the database call namespace that you have to use for external objects. You can't just do like insert your list of external objects, it'll fail. You have to do asynchronous calls instead. But that'll probably be, I'll probably get to that in maybe November, sometime in November. But the next one will be about how to test them.
Cool, man.
Okay. Thank you very much, Neal.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. So we'll be posting the details of the next meetup shortly, but we're looking tentatively the week before Thanksgiving. So